Natasha Denona just dropped this gem of a perfect mini eyeshadow palette. I bought it right away and I wanted to do an entire video just on this palette. So this is the brand new mini Sculpt eye palette. It retails for $27, and if you do want to get it on Natasha Denona's website, I do have a code AngelaBright that'll save you 15%. But when I saw her post this palette on her Instagram stories, I thought it was absolute perfection. So for this video, it's going to be a long one, but I want to start with my first impressions, kind of tell you my initial thoughts and everything on the shades and the gradient, and then of course, I'm going to do an all matte eyeshadow look with this palette. And then at the end of the video, I want to do my swatch comparisons where I'm going to show you some palettes that you might already have in your collection that I think have some similar shades to this one. And then of course, I'm going to compare it to some other Natasha Denona palettes as well. So if that sounds good, let's dive right into it with my first impressions. I just want to get it out of the box here really quick. I did order this on Sephora. I believe it launched the day before Christmas and I ordered it as soon as possible. But like I said, when I first saw this palette, I thought it was absolute perfection. I love the idea of an all matte mini palette. It has a perfect gradient from light to dark, and because it has that perfect gradient, I think this makes it really easy for beginners because sometimes like shades can look muddy when you mix them together, but because these shades are selected to go perfectly together, you're always going to get a beautiful blend. You're not going to get a muddy look. And then especially with how the trend of eyeshadow is nowadays, I feel like the eyeshadow trend kind of goes on a pendulum. I think Kelly Gooch has talked about this a lot with just trends in general, where I would say kind of when I started my YouTube channel, you know, back in 2015, 2016, eyeshadow was huge. Everyone was launching eyeshadow palettes. We were all doing these like bold, graphic, intense eyeshadow looks. And then I'd say around 2020 with the pandemic, you know, the pendulum kind of shifted and we went a lot more towards minimalist eye makeup looks. And since then, I would say that the eyeshadow trend has still kind of been more on the softer side, but it feels like we're like slowly dipping our toes back into shadow, but I feel like the trend is just neutral eyeshadow looks. You know, I think of other palettes that have launched recently. We have the Huda Beauty Icy Nude palette, Makeup by Mario Ethereal Eyes Moonlight palette. The overall trend of eyeshadow has been more neutral, and I'm really into that. I am so into a simple neutral eye look, and what I've been doing recently for like my everyday look is I'll just take some kind of bronzer shade, put that in my crease, maybe deepen it up a little bit, add a shimmer shade, and I'm good to go. Like that is what I like to wear on a daily basis. So having a little palette like this to pair with some of my favorite shimmery sparkling shades, I freaking love. Yes, I do think that most of us probably already own these shadows somewhere in our eyeshadow collection, but I just love the idea of having all of these 5 perfect matte shades together. It'll be great for travel, again, great for beginners or people who just struggle to come up with combos. I love the tones of this so far. Before I've even swatched it or put it on my eyes, it does look more neutral leaning. It is really not that warm toned, which I do like because it is called the Eye Sculpt palette. So think of kind of like a contour palette for your eyes. One thing I want to point out too that I really like is just the name of the shades in general. It goes fair, light, medium, deep, and black. Like how simple and easy is that? So then while this palette is all matte, there is actually 2 different formulas in here. The 2 lightest shades in here are her Silky Matte formula, which is a perfect matte formula. I really do love that one. And then the 3 deeper shades in here are her Creamy Matte formula, which again is still a very blendable, easy to work with formula. So I have high hopes, I have high expectations for this, so let's do an eye look. My eyes are primed and ready for eyeshadow. I did prime them with the Rare Beauty eyeshadow primer and I set that with a translucent powder. I'm gonna start with the shade Light on my fluffy crease brush. Okay, I'm noticing right away as I'm picking up this shadow, there is not a lot of kickback at all, which is kind of nice. So I have that shade on the tip of this brush and I'm gonna run this throughout my entire crease. And then all of the brushes I'm using today are from Sigma Beauty, and I do have a code with them as well. It's just Angela Bright, and that'll save you some money. And I always list and link all the products and brushes I'm using down below in the description box. I was very excited when I saw this shade in the palette because for me and my pretty fair skin tone, this is kind of like the perfect transition shade. I'm gonna grab a little bit more, but when I first saw this shadow, it reminded me a lot of the shade in the Patrick Ta Major Dimension 3 palette that I've hit pan on and everything. And we'll go more in depth on that during the swatches and everything, but that was my first thought when I saw this light shade shadow. And it really is just adding this kind of nice depth and contour to my eye without being too pigmented. Just a little before and after there for you. You can just see it just added a little bit of color in there, and I really like that. I think for this video, and especially being my very first look with this palette, I think I want to do kind of what my everyday look would be with this palette. I'm taking even more of that light shade and I'm going to stamp that on the outer part of my eyelid. Just to add a little bit of color out here. I'm going to switch to a smaller brush for the lower lash line. This is a small crease brush, so I have that same shadow just on the tip of this brush, and I'm going to run that across my entire lower lash line. Now I want to add some more depth, so I'm going to pick up the medium shade on that same fluffy crease brush. And again, this is the creamy matte formula, so I'm going to pick that up, see if there's any kickback. There's a little bit, you can see that in the pan there, but still not an absurd amount. So again, that shade's on the tip of my brush, and I'm just going to lightly pat that on the outer part of my eyelid. Oh yeah, this is definitely adding some color now. And I'm just using a very soft hand and doing little circular motions with this shadow. So I did start by tapping it on my lid, and then I'm bringing whatever's left over into my outer crease area. These two brown shades are blending perfectly into each other. Then going back to my small crease brush with that medium shade. Again, I just have that on the tip of my brush. I'm noticing when I pick up this shadow, it's pretty pigmented. Like, I really feel like you don't need a lot on your brush with this creamy matte formula. And I'm gonna bring this shade along my entire lower lash line. And then I also wanted to point out that I'm getting no fallout with these shadows on my face. Now, I have always said this, but I love when a palette has a light vanilla shade like this because I can use it for so many different reasons. I'm gonna take a little bit of that on my fluffy brush, and I'm just gonna use this shadow to kind of clean up the edges right along here. So I'm kind of following the angle of my lower lash line going outwards and just softening out all of these edges. So if you have pretty fair skin like I do, you can use this shadow for this kind of step. And you can also use this shade to kind of brighten up parts of your eye. So I'm gonna pick up more of this on the flat side of my small crease brush. So I have it on my brush like that, and you can use this to kind of brighten up some areas. So for me, I like to have a nice gradient on my eye from light to dark. So I'm gonna use this to brighten up this inner part of my lid. I'm also happy to see this light shade in this matte formula because I feel like when I see other brands do this shade, it's normally kind of like one of those satiny shadows or like one of those matte shadows that has shimmer in it, and I hate that kind of formula. Like, give me a true matte. This also reminds me a lot of the shade Bare from my palette with Sigma. Like I said, I love when a palette has this kind of shade in it. Now, last little step for blending, I'm gonna go back to the very first shade that I started with, that transition light shade, and I'm just taking a little bit of that and I'm just gonna run over everything in my crease just to make sure it is nice and smooth. But I gotta say, this is looking so good. It really does look like my eye is sculpted and that it's not like full of eyeshadow right now. Just look at that kind of side-by-side difference. And the little bit of sculpting is nice. I like that there's some dimension and depth to this eye. And then the last shade I'm gonna grab is the black shade on a small angled brush. And I'm just gonna stamp this along the very outer part of my top lash line. What's nice about this black shadow being in this cream matte formula is that you're not really gonna get any fallout with this black shade. And then I'm doing a tiny little flick on the outer corner. Nothing crazy though. What I'm noticing about this color is that it doesn't seem like a true matte deep black shade, so I really want to compare it to some other black shades later on in the video. To me, it still has just like a touch of brown in it, so it's not super intense, which I do really like. All right, mascara is on. I'm just wearing my favorite one, which is the Tower 28 Make Waves, and I'm using the black shade Jet. Because this is such a simple, easy, everyday eye look, I definitely don't need any kind of lash to go with it. Now, just to finish off this look, I'm gonna pop one of my favorite highlighter shades in my inner corner. I'm using the shade Bright from my eyeshadow palette with Sigma. I just love the look of a soft, shimmery inner corner. And here's a final close-up of the eye look. All right, other eye is done, and it's actually been a couple hours since I was just filming, so this makeup has been on my face for about 3 hours now. But I do really love how the soft look turned out. This is definitely something I would wear if I wanted a matte everyday look. I gotta say, I really do love the tones of these two shades that are just like most prominent in my crease. Like, these are the shades that I like to grab for. I like that they're not too warm, they're not too cool toned, they're just kind of like the right, perfect, neutral sculpting shades. So for the purpose of this tutorial and this video, you know, I wanted to stick to just using this palette, do an all matte eye look, you know, except the highlighter shade in my inner corner. But I think in my day-to-day life, the way I would use this palette is probably do like a little soft halo eye using these two shades, maybe a bit of the deeper brown. And then what I would do is take one of my favorite shimmery shades, most likely from the Get Stoned palette. You guys know I am freaking obsessed with this shade, Champagne, right here. So I would do like the whole matte halo eye base and pop just one shimmer on the center of my lid, and that's gonna be like the most perfect everyday, like slightly glam, a little bit sparkly eyeshadow look. And I think that's what I really like about this palette, because that is kind of the look that I've been going for most days when I'm doing my shadow, is a soft halo eye that's all matte and then just one or two shimmers all over the lid. And that makes me think of, you know, like the Patrick Ta duos that came out this year. I know these were so controversial, but honestly, I have been loving this one that I bought. It's the shade We Need Better Lighting. Like, I have a couple trips coming up soon, and I can see myself just using these two palettes and get like my perfect everyday look, or can do something a little bit more glam. I know a lot of people are into like the Urban Decay Moon Dust shadows. I bought this little quad last holiday season, so like any of these kind of toppery shades that are very on trend, I think would pair perfectly with this little mini palette. And then as I was using this palette, I was very impressed by the lack of fallout with these matte shades, because like I've been using the new Huda Beauty Icy Nude palette a lot recently, and that palette has so much kick up on those matte shades. The kickback was so minimal for this palette, and I had zero fallout on my face, especially with these more creamy matte shades right here. Like, not having fallout with this black because it's a creamy matte is just perfect. Now that the eyeshadow tutorial is done, let's dive into some comparison swatches and look at some palettes that have some similar shades that I think are going to be kind of close to this one. All right, let's just start off by swatching this palette so we can see all the shades side by side. So grabbing fair and light. And again, these are her silky matte formula. Yeah, so grabbing this shade, I love the tone of it, but even when I was doing the eyeshadow tutorial, I kind of noticed it's not that pigmented, so I do feel like I need to build it up, and I did have to build it up when I was doing the eye look as well. It is just a very soft, kind of sheer matte shade. I guess I just wish there was a little bit more pigment to this one. Yeah, so that was 3 layers just to build up that shade to get it to look like that. Then I'm gonna grab medium and deep. And remember, these ones are her creamy matte formula. Let's do medium. Yeah, see, that pigment shows up right away. I don't really need to build it up that much. I'm just smoothing out the swatch. And then deep. Then last shade is the black. Now this one I'm excited to swatch because on the eyes, it didn't seem like a super true matte deep black. I felt like there was a little bit of a softness to it. So that's just one swatch of the black. I do think you could build it up to get it even more pigmented. Yeah, so you can definitely build it up if you want, but I kind of like that it's a little bit more on the softer side. All right, so there are all the shades that swatched out. Again, my only issue so far with after doing the eye look and doing these swatches is that this shade is just not as pigmented as I would want it to be. But I can kind of look past that because it is buildable, and honestly, beginners might like that about that shade. Just wanted to point out, I'm trying to get these swatches off with a makeup wipe, which usually works totally fine, but this black shade almost kind of stained my arm a bit. Now that I've swatched it out, I do want to do some eyeshadow comparisons to some pretty popular eyeshadow palettes that maybe you already have in your collection. I want to start this off with a palette that I think is going to be the most similar and that I immediately thought of when I saw this, and that is the Patrick Ta Major Dimension 3 palette. Now, I love this palette. I always talk about how I love this whole row of shadows, and if you look at these side by side, they look pretty close. So what I love about this Patrick Ta palette is that it's split into 2 undertones. This row is your cooler undertones, this one is your more warmer shades. And then these 10 shades are matte, while these 2 are cream, so they're good at like building up a base or using it as a liner. And this Natasha Denona just looks kind of like a mini version of the Patrick Ta palette. And then remember how in the tutorial I was saying that this shade reminds me of the Patrick Ta shade? This is the exact one I was talking about. Like, you can see I love this shade. I hit pan on it. So let's swatch these 2 out. So for the first fair shade, this is more of a true white shade in the Patrick Ta palette, so I think this one's going to be a bit closer. Okay, there's actually, I would say, a tiny bit more peach in that shade. Where Natasha Denona is more of like a bone vanilla, there's a little bit of warmth in this one up here. Moving on to this one that I think is going to be a pretty good match. Oh, okay, maybe not. Okay, see what I mean with the kickback though? The Patrick Ta palette does have quite a bit of kickback when you pick up the shadows with the brush or even your fingers. Those are actually not similar at all. This shade is actually closer to that medium one. Interesting. Okay, I kind of want to see what this shade looks like. This one is a little bit more of a warmer medium tone. Oh yeah, that's pretty close to the 4th shade right there. Looking at the two palettes, I thought these two were gonna be closer, but these two are pretty closer. I think that goes to show just how pigmented these Patrick Ta shadows are though. When using this palette, I did have to build it up quite a bit, even in the swatches too. I am gonna swatch this one. Yeah, see how just right off the bat, like they're just pigmented at first. And then let's do the black. Although there are some differences and they're not complete dupes of each other, I would say if you already have this Patrick Ta one, you definitely don't need the Natasha Denona. You're gonna get way more looks out of this palette. You have a mixture of a cream and matte shades and even more undertones to play with. But formula-wise, these Patrick Ta ones do have more kickback, a little bit more fallout, and they are very pigmented, creamy mattes to work with. And I would say this Natasha Denona one felt more like a beginner-friendly formula. But sometimes it is easy to go kind of overboard with this palette just because the shades are so pigmented at first. So maybe if you are newer to shadow or just have a heavy hand and just want shades that are going to go perfectly together, this one might be a better bet for you. Next, I want to look at the Makeup by Mario Master Mattes, the Neutrals palette. For the light shade, I'm going to swatch MN1. Ooh, that's a pretty good match. And then I'm thinking MN2 for the second shade. Okay, this one is definitely a bit lighter, a little bit more yellow in it. Okay, I'm wondering if MN4 might be a better match. I know this shade's going to be too pinky. Let's try this one. Okay, this one's not a perfect match either. Again, it has a little bit more yellow in it, whereas the Natasha Denona side is just a bit warmer. I'm gonna add MN6. Yeah, for this deep shade right here, this shade just pulls so warm that there's nothing in here that's really gonna match that. But let's do the black. Ooh, see how pigmented that black is right off the bat? Like, that's an intense, true matte black. So for these two palettes, I'd say there definitely is a big difference in the undertones, whereas the shades in the Mario palette lean a little bit more yellow and more of like a true neutral, while these ones still have a little bit of warmth to them. Yeah, so I actually wouldn't say that these two palettes are that similar. Next, I want to move on to a palette that I think a lot of us have in our collection, and that is Anastasia Soft Glam. Now, when I first saw the Natasha Denona palette, I did not initially think of Soft Glam, but I think I saw someone on Reddit mention it. So for that fair shade, I definitely want to start with Tempera. Now remember how in my tutorial I was saying I love this type of shade in a palette, but some brands will make it a satin or something? That's what Anastasia did. So this shade is not a true matte. There's definitely a tiny bit of a sheen in there. I'd say those shades are pretty close. There's just a touch more pink in Tempera. Now I already know that none of these shades are going to look like the shade Light, but I'm just going to go ahead and swatch Orange Soda since that's like the next lightest matte shade. I actually just did a video using the Anastasia Soft Glam palette on my channel. Yeah, look at how orangey that is compared to Natasha. I can already tell you for sure that the shades in Soft Glam are just going to be much, much warmer, but I just kind of wanted to show what the gradient would look like from this palette. And then for more of a medium brown, I'd probably do Burnt Orange. And then I'm going to grab a Rustic. And then of course Noir for the black. Again, another really good black shade. I do love the Anastasia eyeshadow formula a lot. So again, the tones are very different for these two palettes. Anastasia is much warmer, while Natasha is more neutral leaning. You can definitely still get a really pretty gradient out of the Soft Glam palette. Now I have to grab the one palette that I feel like I'm always comparing every single eyeshadow launch to, and that is ColourPop Stone Cold Fox. Like I said, I'm always pulling out this palette when doing swatch comparisons because it's just such a good giant palette. Now, first glance, you might not think these look so similar, but there are some shades that are just popping out at me that I need to see them side by side. So for the fair shade, I'm gonna swatch Luxe. Okay, I would say that one is a bit more white, whereas Natasha's more yellow. And then I can't decide if I want to do Trip or Stranger. Kind of leaning towards Stranger, so I'm gonna grab that. Okay, that's a pretty good match. And honestly, the pigment on the ColourPop one is kind of more what I expect and what I like personally. For the medium shade, I'm gonna grab Quarry Days. Not a perfect match, but pretty close. For the deep shade, I'm gonna grab Fickle Fate. See how powdery and messy these shadows are though? Like, that's just sometimes the payoff you get when you're dealing with very pigmented shadows. They're just gonna have fallout. So for that shade, the ColourPop side is definitely more cool toned leaning, where Natasha is more warm. Then grabbing the black shade, Rock Bottom. Again, they're not a perfect match, but there are those two side by side. I have another ColourPop palette I want to look at, and that is the Bare Necessities. There are those two palettes side by side. The ColourPop palette is a very warm palette, especially compared to a Stone Cold Fox that I just showed. So for the fair shade, I'm going to swatch Full Expose. Okay, those are closer than I thought. In the pan, this shade almost looks like, I don't know, a bit more gray almost, but that actually looks pretty dang close. For the light shade, I'm gonna swatch In the Buff. Okay, so this shade is only like slightly deeper than Full Expose and just a tad bit lighter than the Natasha Denona one. For the medium shade, I can't decide between Bubbles and Hot Gossip. Like, I'm trying to look at those side by side. That one's tricky. Even Banter could be close. I guess that could kind of be a good thing though, because this palette looks kind of like an expanded version of the Natasha Denona with a lot more kind of warmer shades in here. I think I'm gonna go with Hot Gossip. Let's see how that looks. A little bit more warm than that shade. And then even for the deep shade, I feel like there's quite a few colors in here too that could be a decent match. Let's try Tabloid. And then of course the black shade Spyglass. I'm really not trying to swatch the black shades too heavily just because it is pretty hard to get the swatches off of my arm. So again, same thing, you can get another really pretty gradient from the ColourPop palette, but this side is just a bit warmer and kind of shows how more neutral these shades are. Let's finish off by looking at some existing Natasha Denona palettes. I want to start with Natasha Denona I Need a Nude just because I feel like this is her most popular palette and I know a lot of people have this one from her. Now I can tell you already these shades are not going to look the same, but I really just wanted to show the difference in undertones because the matte shades in here do lean so much more cool tone and mauve-y, you know, besides these two ones. Whereas these ones are going to pull a bit more warm being swatched next to these. So for the fair shade, I'm going to grab Fair. Funny how these two shades are both named Fair, but they are completely different shadows. This one looks a lot more yellow. Yeah, this one does have a bit more peach in it. And then for the light shade, I'm gonna grab Mesh. Yeah, like I said, these are gonna be a lot cooler. Now I'm gonna do Stone. Really just trying to show you these matte shades side by side. To this day, I'm still confused on why this palette needed both of these shades, but not my problem. Let's do Tender. And then the deepest shade is Silhouette, which is more of a dark brown. This one is not a black. Yes, you can really see the difference in undertones with those two palettes. I just knew someone out there was going to want to see these two side by side, so. And then I wanted to show this next to the Natasha Denona Glam palette. I'm not going to swatch this one out because there really are no similar shades. Again, you're getting two very different color stories, where this one's going to pull a lot more warm. And then I wanted to look at My Dream, which is one of my favorite Natasha Denona palettes. Let's just do a quick side by side here. So in both palettes, you do have a black, and this is a very, very pigmented black. There really is no fair shade like that one. I'm just going to add Nurture to my arm just to show you this one. This is a very pigmented brown shade. I'm just going to add this down here. And that one does look a bit similar to the medium shade. And then as far as the deep shade, I would say Familia might be the closest, but this one is very, very warm. Yeah, there is a lot of red in this shadow. And then the other matte shades in here are a bit more peachy with these two. And then you have some kind of more purple leaning shades as well. Definitely some differences there. And then the last palette I wanted to compare this to is the Natasha Denona Biba palette. Now I want to say this was like her first all neutral palette. This launched years ago. Mine is so squeaky. This shade is a black. It has fallen out and broken. Like, this is an old palette. It's so funny looking at the Biba palette now because, you know, she did call it a neutral palette, but this palette really is so warm. All of these shades right here either have red, yellow, or orange in it, which are gonna pull warm, where you can just see the undertones, and I feel like this palette is more of a true neutral compared to the Biba one. So those are all the swatches I'm gonna do for this palette. All right, so that is going to wrap up this video. Again, if you guys are interested in this new mini palette, if you wanna buy it on Natasha's website, my code AngelaBright will save you some money. I would love to know your guys' thoughts on this palette. Do you love this mini palette, or do you think it's boring and so repetitive? You already have these shades. I would love to know your opinions, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.